Hello everybody, welcome to the Thursday edition of Video Clips, and we're going to be talking about the gut microbiome today. So you probably have noticed lots of messages on vitamin D this year, lots of messages on the gut microbiome, but different ways of looking at it. And so I'm just going to start here. According to a recent review, the typical Western diet, which as we know, contains too much of everything, which is interesting. So everybody talks about where do you get your protein and where do you get your calcium, like you're at risk of deficiency. Our problem in this country is too much fat, too many calories, too much protein, too much sugar. Well, anyway, it negatively affects immune function. It damages the gut microbiome, and it can even pass on certain disadvantages to children. And that's the point of the message today, not just that when we eat poorly our gut suffers, but we can actually affect future generations, and I find that really fascinating. So according to the author of this article, Ian Miles, most people are aware that the Western diet increases the risk of conditions like heart disease and kidney disease and obesity. But we don't think of it so much in terms of the immune system. There are a lot of different mechanisms for this type of damage, but one is that when you eat a Westernized diet, you gain weight. And fat cells, or adipocytes, produce inflammatory substances such as interleukin-1, interleukin-2, and tumor necrosis factor. Miles says that these inflammatory substances can act like false alarms, continuing to stimulate immune response. At some point in time, the system stops responding. A situation, I like his analogy here. He likens it to, if you have a battery or if you have a smoke alarm in your house that keeps responding and going off even when there's no fire, you know how you just disable the battery and say, I can't take that anymore? Okay. Well, he says that's kind of what happens to the immune system. It just stops responding after a while. And when a person whose immune system has basically switched itself off, encounters a pathogen like a virus or a bacteria, the immune system doesn't respond, and the person can be at risk of a prolonged and even more serious illness. And we see this here with people who have serial infections, like one sinus infection after another, or yeast infections, one after another. They just never get better. Bladder infections, that sort of thing. Another factor that affects immunity is that obese people have fewer white blood cells to fight infection, and those white blood cells have lower activity. So a lot of times people ask, what is the connection between obesity and so many different diseases? It's the inflammatory condition, and it's also the immune system's inability to respond appropriately. Now, Miles cites in vitro studies showing that processed sugars reduce phagocytosis, and that's the ingestion of bacteria and other substances by white blood cells, and increases levels of inflammatory cytokines in the bloodstream. The sugars also negatively affect the gut microbiome, since pathogenic bacteria prefer sugars. So we have weight status that affects the gut microbiome and immune function. We have sugar intake. People in our country, a lot of overweight people eating a lot of sugar. I used to be one of them. And then saturated fat, and this really fascinated me and something that I didn't realize. Saturated fat can also affect immune function in two ways. It increases prostaglandin production, and it changes the makeup of cell membranes, which then changes their function. Miles states that, and this is a quote, he says, perhaps the most concerning aspect of modern dietary fat is its ability to directly trigger the inflammatory process. And part of what happens is saturated fats bind to cells called toll-like receptors, which sense the presence of bacteria. The immune system then perceives saturated fat as a bacterial invader, which leads to an immune response and inflammation in the GI tract. This can alter the gut microbiome, resulting in leaky gut, which is a breakdown of the barrier system, which keeps things that shouldn't be getting into the bloodstream out. The entry of increasing numbers of things like partially digested food fragments and toxins and other substances can cause constant triggering of the immune system to make antibodies. And so on the one hand, we were talking before about the immune system just shutting itself off after a while. The other thing that can go wrong is the immune system goes into overdrive, and then it can't shut itself off, and that's how people end up with autoimmune diseases. Now, the damage to our bodies is not limited to ourselves, and here's where things really get interesting. It can affect future generations. Studies show that a woman's diet during pregnancy influences taste preferences for children, and the development of the gut microbiome in the fetus starts during pregnancy and accelerates during childbirth and breastfeeding. Women who have imbalances of bacteria pass the imbalance on to their children. Thus, children can begin life with an impaired immune system, because remember that gut microbiome microbiome has a lot to do with immune function and an impaired immune system that's unable to fight off infections and quite possibly unable to differentiate foreign proteins from self-autoimmune. Fathers, by the way, are not exempt from responsibility for the health of the immune system for their offspring. Paternal diets affect methylation of DNA and can be inherited by children. Epigenetic changes in DNA translate to cellular memory, which can be passed from parent to child. And there is some evidence that this is even passed on to grandchildren. Miles explains this, that cells that have essentially learned bad habits, such as ignoring infection or overreacting to antigens, set the stage for chronic illness. So what he's really saying in this study and what the research shows is that moms and dads who eat poorly, first of all, in the case of the mother, you can pass the taste preference on to the child. So if you eat a lot of garbage, the child wants garbage too. And this isn't the only study that's shown that, by the way. But adverse changes to your gut microbiome can be passed on to your child. A father who eats improperly will have changes in DNA, which directly is passed on to the children and can affect another generation. So it's interesting, it's scary, but it may help to motivate some people, because sometimes people are not so motivated to change their ways for themselves, but they can become incredibly motivated to change their habits in order to do better by their children and future generations. So I found this really fascinating, and so many ways food interacts with our system to either improve or destroy health, and the gut microbiome is one. Now, here's another one. And this has to do with the gut microbiome in obese children. And another group of people, which is children with Prader-Willi Syndrome, and I'll tell you what that has to do with it in a second. But, I've written a lot about this connection between health and gut bacteria. And there are a lot of things that you can do to fix it. Diet is one, probiotics is one, is another that plays a role. But in this study, it shows that diet can override, and it has some implications for the gut microbiome, can override genetic predisposition to obesity. And I found this interesting, I guess, because there's so many overweight women in my family. Like, I'm the only normal weight woman in my family ever. And so I think that I have the obesity gene. So you know that if I misbehave, I'm going to start looking bigger in the camera every week. That's one of the things that I'm predisposed to develop. So anyway, to look at this issue, researchers recruited morbidly obese children. And the children in this study either had a condition called Prader-Willi Syndrome, or PWS. It's a genetic disease that predisposes children to overeat and become obese. Or the other type of children, where they had what was called simple diet-related obesity. They just overate. And the intervention that they were recruited for was a hospital-based intervention. The kids were given 3 ready-to-consume traditional Chinese medicinal foods and prebiotics, along with a lot of fruit, vegetables, and nuts. Now, the first formula included macronutrients from whole grains, high-fiber plant foods, buckwheat, oat, beans, corn, yams, peanuts, and soybeans. The other formulas contained prebiotics, and they were given by infusion. The kids were on the diet for 30 days. Now, at the beginning of the study, the researchers discovered that the gut microbiota of both the kids with Prader-Willi and the kids who had developed simple diet-related obesity were similar, and they were impaired. But after the intervention, the microbiome of both groups of kids had improved. Now, remember, the Prader-Willi kids are genetically predisposed to develop obesity. So their impaired gut and their obese condition was somewhat based on their genetic predisposition. But the researchers wrote, the dietary intervention in this study shifted the metabolism in the gut microbiota from fermenting proteins and fats to carbohydrate, corrected the dysbiosis of the gut microbiota, which in return may have contributed to alleviation of metabolic deteriorations in genetic as well as simple obesity. Diets trump genetics every time. In addition to changes in the gut microbiome, children in both groups lost weight. The kids with Prader-Willi lost an average of 7.6% of their body weight. Kids with simple obesity, 9.5%. This is particularly important with the Prader-Willi kids. I know a handful of families who deal with a child, who have a child with this disorder, and it is almost impossible for these kids to lose weight. It's very, very difficult, so this is significant. In conclusion, the researchers wrote, our study shows that dietary modulation of the gut gut microbiota contributes to the alleviation of metabolic deteriorations in both Prader-Willi syndrome and simple obesity cohorts, suggesting a common etiological role of dysbiotic microbiota for disease progression, regardless of whether the obesity is genetically predisposed or simple diet induced. So I've been saying this for years. You're not a victim of your genetic predisposition. It's just a predisposition. So a combination of a diet based on plant foods and prebiotics resulted in healthier guts and weight loss for kids, regardless of their genetic profile. It's, like I mentioned, helpful for everybody, but I've not had a lot of good things to offer families who have a child with Prader-Willi syndrome. This is one of the most encouraging things I've seen. All right, so eat better, you get healthier, your gut microbiota changes, your gut's happier, everybody's happier, the planet's happier, the environment's happier, the animals are happier, lots of reasons to change to a plant-based diet. All right, that's all for today. As usual, pass this on to anybody who you think might enjoy watching it, and I'll be back to you next week on Tuesday with more news.